Welcome. We will be starting soon as we have more people to be involved with the conversation come in. And for those listening to the beginning of the audio, never mind the mundane, trivial comments I make, as we will be wasting time for other people to come in. I think the topic at hand is an important one, and it is absolutely misrepresented by not just those in power, or the State Department, but also from historians in itself. There will be a number of sources I will be using to conduct this short lecture about the history of Al Qaeda, in which I'll be using most of my information from the Tariq Osama or the Osama history documents, which were under the ownership of bin Laden's confidant, Anam Aranut, who is head of the Benevolence International Foundation office in Sarajevo. These documents were seized by Bosnian police in March of 2002 when they made the connection after the September 11th attacks of Al Qaeda and the Benevolence International Foundation. I will be also using sources from notable historians, ones such as Thomas Hedgehammer, a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment and the author of the magnum opus, The Caravan, biography of Abdullah Yusuf Azam, as well as Anne Stenmanson, research fellow at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, in which she wrote the book Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. And also the testimony of Jamal al-Fadl, a former Al Qaeda associate and original member of the group, who turned into a confidential informant and later testified against Osama bin Laden in the mid-1990s and gave the FBI the hierarchy and the committees that were involved with the organization. The history of Al Qaeda itself has been mired under disinformation and irrational conspiracies, claiming that the group itself was nothing more than a base, a computer base of government operatives from Israel and Saudi Arabia and the United States, which conduct international terrorism. Although this is false, some of this is affiliated with government agencies itself. The group Al Qaeda was not formed in an operational base, but rather a base of operations for Arabs, in which during the course of this short discussion, I will outline the initial years of Al Qaeda, that which is hardly ever discussed or tenured by so-called experts on Middle East terrorism, and very few, including the names I just mentioned, such as Thomas Hedgehammer and Anne Stenmanson, very few who have informed the public responsibly and properly about how Al Qaeda was formed in the initial years. And I think it starts with the Afghan Soviet War of 1979 to tell you a little bit of a background regarding one such individual who was a pertinent influence in not just the creation of Al Qaeda, but also a creation of a foreign services base which has some affiliation with Al Qaeda. But both would go on to have a huge and influential history regarding the 1990s, the 2000s, and beyond. When the Soviets invaded the capital of Kabul in Afghanistan in 1979, the Islamic world took hold and announced a jihad of sorts against the secular Soviet invaders, in which the resounding response by the Islamic community was in unison. Most of the fighters in Afghanistan are Pashtun. They come from a different theology, a theology known as Ibn Hanbal, or the school of Ibn Hanbal. Afghans themselves are very insular people, vigorous fighters, generations and generations of history regarding expelling foreign invaders in a country that has never been conquered. One Arab individual who had an interest not just in what was going on in Afghanistan, but also with the Islamic community as a whole. 1979 was a key year for a specific group of Muslims. These would be known as the Wahhabis, also known as Takfiris. Wahhabis are considered an abridged version of Islam, or Sunni Islam, anti-ethical to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, but they go by the teachings of the hadiths, or memoirs, attributed to the Prophet. These groups of people that adhere to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab would be considered those of the first and second generations of the Prophet Muhammad, those that were considered the more militant or more fervent believers of Islam. The individual I'm going to be talking about is Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden himself came out of Abdul Aziz University with an electrical engineering background. And after leaving college in 1979, bin Laden, whose father was killed in a plane accident surveying a field, in which he is the founder of the Saudi Bin Laden Group, the largest construction firm in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden was without any direction. And without a father, he went to join a cause that he said in which the Soviets' invasion made him outraged that an injustice had been committed against the people of Afghanistan. Bin Laden used his money from his father's businesses and machinery from the Saudi Bin Laden Construction Company to help build roads and ditches, as well as building temporary huts and housing for the Mujahideen resistance. And immediately upon the creation of the Mujahideen, or allowing Arabs to enter the fray, in which Arabs only represented 10% of the fighting force in the Mujahideen. Afghans didn't like Arabs and considered them irrelevant to the fighting cause. They were considered inferior in terms of combat, in terms of fighting. The Afghans had hundreds and hundreds of years of guerrilla warfare training. The Arabs did not. However, according to certain Afghan warlords, like Abdul Rasul Sayyaf and Jalaluddin Haqqani, they considered them invaluable. many Afghan warlords did not like Arabs and refused to even allow them into their training camps in Afghanistan. Bin Laden himself was seen as a pariah of sorts. And while the CIA had conducted activities in Afghanistan, including the most successful and largest CIA operation in history, Operation Cyclone, which saw hundreds of millions of dollars go through the Pakistan ISI. The United States didn't want to create World War III of sorts and stood out of Afghanistan, instead dealing with the nefarious Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Organization, otherwise known as the ISI. And so between the years 1979 to 1992, the United States, using Operation Cyclone and the CIA, along with Saudi Arabia, China, Israel, Great Britain, spent between $6 to $12 billion of financial aid and weapons to tens of thousands of Afghan Mujahideen, using the Pakistan ISI as the conduit. Bin Laden himself saw the bias from the Afghan Mujahideen and wanted to build a base of operations for Arabs. And so in 1986, Bin Laden, who was quoted by Ann Sterenson as saying, 1986 were the happiest days of my life. And in October of that year, started work on a remote construction site in the Jaji region of Khost, Afghanistan, east of the country. The site was founded by individuals named Amzari and Shaufiq. These are associates of Bin Laden, in which they went on a reconnaissance trip he had taken with a group of Afghans just the month before. What made this place so incredible was that it had a direct line of vision to the Soviet fort called Ali Kel, which was situated next to an important strategic area called Panichnar-Gardez Highway. However, no one was there, neither the Soviets nor the Afghan Mujahideen. It was rather incredulous. This place was become known as Al-Masada, translated from the Arabic, the Lion's Den. It would later play a central part in the mythology of Al-Qaeda. But at the time of its founding, there was little to suggest that there would be a birthplace of the world's most dangerous terrorist organization. But Bin Laden's construction team consisted of 4 men, a bulldozer, a tent, and Afghan guards. Even though that this would be an Arab base, the first and only Arab base in Afghanistan, Bin Laden still had to get approval from notable Afghan warlords such as Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, who was considered the largest and most important Afghan warlord in Pakistan. The original purpose of the project was to build a forward base for the Afghan Mujahideen stationed at Jaj Base, which is located approximately 5 hours to the south. The Jaj Base was controlled by Abdul Rasul Sayyaf and was an important base for training, supply, and staging of operations for Afghan Mujahideen in the area. But Sayyaf's training camps also had Arabs, as well as Jalaluddin Haqqani, were the only Afghan warlords who would allow Arabs to train with them. According to Ann Stemmonson's book, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, many of the Arab volunteers who had never seen combat, Jaj represented a front line of sorts, but it was more suitable for war tourism than real participation in fighting. And the base had been expanding and fortifying between the years of 1983 to 1986 on the advice of Brigadier Youssef, the Pakistan ISI's representative to the Afghan Mujahideen. The same order had gone out to Jalaluddin Haqqani, who controlled a similar supply point in the southern port of Kast. And according to Brigadier Youssef, up to 60% of the ISI supplies from Operation Cyclone went to the Afghan Mujahideen and were passing through these two bases only. However, another Afghan warlord, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, leader of the Hizb-e-Islami army, would become the most notable, the most powerful, and the most nefarious warlord in the Soviet-Afghan War, and even within the two civil wars in Afghanistan. The Israeli Mossad, the Great Britain, MI6, the CIA, the Saudi General Intelligence Directorate would send Hekmatyar hundreds of millions of dollars through the Hizb-e-Islami army, which also went to Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, Jalaluddin Haqqani, Abu Hafs al-Iraqi, and dozens of other Afghan warlords. But Hekmatyar would become the primary warlord in all of Afghanistan that would receive funding from foreign and domestic intelligence services. In 1986, bin Laden's construction company was involved with the work on the Jaj base, and the team consisted of a handful of young Saudi men, some of whom were eager to participate in battles, but according to bin Laden's own account, he allowed two of the men, Azmari and Shaufiq, to build the site of al-Masada. In spite of its seemingly perfect location, it was not used by the Afghans because it was remote and had no road in the winter. Bin Laden wrote to Sayyaf and offered to build the road, and according to bin Laden, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf agreed because he saw the value of the Arab camp and the base between himself and the Arabs. This would be an Arab camp training in small arms fire and the making of crude bombs that would be used on Soviet military vehicles, especially tanks, along the Gardez highway. Only Sayyaf ended up supporting bin Laden with the Guard force and later with weapons and fighters. The idea that Arabs should man the place does not appear to have been part of the initial agreement. An idea that an Arab camp would exist in Afghan lands would be considered an affront. But bin Laden was considered a hero of sorts by using his father's construction company to help the Afghan Mujahideen, and he was given carte blanche to conduct operations, including building an Arab training camp. What made this rather an important operational base was that there was an important battle that took place later on, and a battle that would actually give bin Laden credence and his small Arab group a mythology of sorts that would grow outside of Afghanistan and all throughout the world. And it was the Battle of Jaj. This battle would be considered the most important battle in Afghanistan, a battle that would define not just Osama bin Laden, but also the group known as the Lion's Den, which will later be called Al-Qaeda. And from the Arabic, Al-Qaeda is the base. The base meaning Lion's Den, meaning Al-Masada training base. During the years of 1987, a battle took place at the Al-Masada. And according to Thomas Hedgehammer and Ann Stevenson, Al-Masada was basically in the crude ending of training and formation. According to those who survived the battle, only about 20 to 25 Arabs were at this base. The Russian Spetsnaz, which is the special forces, had approximately 230 to 300 people trying to attack the Al-Masada camp. And at the end of May, using only handguns and a few Kalashnikovs, the Arabs themselves, during this battle, repelled the invading forces of the Spetsnaz Special Forces. It was considered an enormous victory, a victory that defied odds and defied even rationale, considering that the Spetsnaz themselves are special forces of Soviet Union who were considered a superpower that would end up being defeated by a ragtag bunch of Arabs with nothing more than sticks, handguns, and some machine guns. Word got around that the Battle of the Arabs themselves, in which they would kill approximately 50 to 100 Spetsnaz soldiers at the end of May of 1987. The numbers, however, are not possible to confirm, but the importance here is not so much the numbers. It is the massive propaganda effect that these stories came to have on the status of bin Laden in Afghanistan and the Arabs in general affiliated with bin Laden. The contribution of the Arabs at al-Masada consolidated bin Laden's status as a military leader of the Arabs and paved the way for the establishment of al-Qaeda as an organization independent from the services office. I want to talk a little bit about the services office. And I think this is important. This is affiliated with al-Masada and the conflict in Afghanistan. And it is important to understand that even though the Afghan Services Bureau worked separately from al-Masada, there is some associated link in which I will explain in full to you. The idea came from an Egyptian journalist named Mustafa Hamid in 1983, who was friends with a notable theologian named Abdullah Yusuf Azam when they both went to study at Cairo University. Hamid had an idea for notable Arab fighters that were coming from all around the world to enter the fray in Afghanistan and tried to operate a foreign recruitment office. Hamid's initial idea was a failure only because he did not have the financial means to operate it. The idea of operating a recruitment office would take major funding and also many people to help operate it, that which Hamid did not have. Hamid explained the idea to Azam, and by late 1983, Azam noticed that the Afghan Mujahideen had largely become fragmented due to the infighting and due to the many competing egos of Afghan warlords such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Jalaluddin Haqqani, and Abu Hajar Ali Raqi. The differences were ranging from ideology and strategy, and with the many different personalities and ambitions from these leaders, Azam had become disillusioned with the politics and disassociated himself from trying to have them come together. And when Azam had traveled and relocated to Afghanistan from Saudi Arabia, where he was teaching Wahhabi theology, he vowed never to try again. While Azam was teaching at the Thagar school in Saudi Arabia, one of his students would come in and listen to him. One of those students was Osama bin Laden. bin Laden had never forgotten the orator skills of Azzam while he was teaching at the university. Azzam relocated to Afghanistan on the orders of Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, who told him that one day in Afghanistan was 1,000 years to the life of Islam. And so, in 1983, Azzam began concentrating how to influence Arabs to enter the conflict, as he would write many essays, books, and give endless lectures during the years of 1983 to 1984, including visits to the United States. One such discussion and talk was held at the University of Indianapolis. It is also asserted that Osama bin Laden had traveled to Indianapolis in the early 1980s to listen to Azzam speak. Azzam also feared that American and European non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, were trying to westernize Afghanistan, and he resented this presence and began to formulate an idea which would have only Afghan Arab funding the conflicts itself. Azzam had traveled with Abdullah Anas, an Algerian Mujahideen fighter, to Saudi Arabia to visit bin Laden and bring in an idea of pitching an idea of building an Afghan Services Bureau, which would be the primary source of said funding coming from Afghans and Arabs. Osama bin Laden was blown away by the idea and agreed to the idea itself and gave the initial funding to Abdullah Azzam and to another Saudi, Wael Juladdin. Juladdin had known Azzam previously while they were in Saudi Arabia. And the initial funding from bin Laden went to the Maktab al-Khidmat, translated from the Arabic, the Afghan Services Bureau. The Bureau had a dual mission. One, to service the Afghan Mujahideen. Two, to be the starting point for Arabs in the service of Afghans. There would be a variety of domains within the Bureau as well, as they would cater to logistics, education, medical support. A number of different committees would be involved with the Maktab al-Khidmat. The committees involved a bureau committee, a consultative committee, and other committees such as a reception committee, an education committee, a scholars committee, orphans and widows committee, a medical committee, and a media committee. The idea of the Maktab al-Khidmat began to grow within Pakistan, and a number of buildings would be built in Pakistan. By the summer of 1986, Khalid Abu al-Dahab, an associate of an Egyptian informant for the CIA and the FBI and Osama bin Laden, Ali Muhammad, initially founded a branch in Brooklyn, New York, called the Al-Khifa Refugee Center. And by 1987, Mustafa Shalabi, Fawaz al-Damra, and Ali Shanawi filed papers incorporating Al-Khifa Refugee Center as an extension of physical building, which was initially located in the Al-Farouq Mosque in Brooklyn, New York City. The address was 566 Atlantic Avenue, and then later on, the Al-Khifa would move from the Al-Farouq and build its own offices 1 block away. Mustafa Shalabi would be the primary director of operations while being an imam at the Al-Farouq Mosque. Abdullah Yusuf Azzam was named emir of the Maktab al-Khidmat. Shalabi and Azam were both close friends and had an idea of creating Afghanistan as an Islamic staging point and a country that would cater to just Afghans and Arabs. The Al-Kifa Refugee Center actually being the only place where a building operating with Shalabi, in which he would recruit two men who had served in the Afghan War, Mahmoud Abalima and El Said Nosser. Both men would become regular attendees of the Al-Faruq Mosque in Brooklyn and also the Masjid al-Salam in Jersey City, New Jersey. While Abdullah Yusuf Azam was named the emir of the bureau, Mamdouh Mahmoud Salim was the acting deputy leader, or Munir, of the Afghan Services Bureau in 1986. I also have to bring up the committees of the group of Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda itself would have a number of committees involved within the organization as they begin to grow following the Battle of Jaj. These committees would have a Shura committee, which would be led by its religious foundation, and a military committee, which would operate within al-Masada and a number of other camps that would grow later on in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. There would be a number of training camps such as Kandahar, Al-Sada, Al-Faruq, Tarnak Farms, Darunta, Al-Ghuraba, Jihad Wal, Kaldeen, Lakshar-e-Taiba, Khalid bin Walid, Manshura Jihad, and the Malik Military Center. Many of these training camps came during the 1980s and 1990s. Some were still in operation just 2 years prior to the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. According to Jamal al-Fadl's testimony in the United States versus Osama bin Laden trial, Jamal al-Fadl was one of the primary founders of Al-Qaeda. According to the Tariq and Osama documents, which are primarily written in Arabic, these documents would later be known as the foundations for Al-Qaeda. According to Jamal al-Fadl, a high-level meeting took place in a guest house in Khost, Afghanistan. There, Abu Ayyub al-Iraqi and Yassin Abu Ayyab al-Iraqi would hand al-Fadl some documents to sign. It was a document which stated that the designated signer would declare bayat, or from the Arabic, unwavering loyalty, to Osama bin Laden, which was selected as the single emir of the group, in which they would continue the jihad outside of Afghanistan if a conflict would ever take place. There would be another meeting, according to al-Fadl, that would take place in the training camp Jihad Wal al-Faruq, which was renamed to al-Faruq, which would have many signatures to this group, and they considered these people to be the initial founders of Al-Qaeda. Abu Ayyab al-Iraqi, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, Abu Faraj al-Yemeni, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, also known as Dr. Abdel Moez, Saeed Imam al-Sharif, also known as Dr. Fadl, Abu Burham al-Iraqi, Abu Hafs al-Masri, also known as Muhammad Atef, Muhammad Musab al-Saudi, Abdallah Izzuddin, Abu Fadl al-Maki, and Mamdouh Mahmoud Salim. Jamal al-Fadl explained for the New York prosecutors in 1995 that during the meeting, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri would hand over documents which stated the group's agendas, rules, and duties. It also had designated committees, such as the Shura Council, which was led by Ahmed al-Zawahiri and Abu Haraj al-Yemeni, as well as Dr. Fadl, a military committee headed by Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri and Abu Hafs al-Masri, and a fatwa and religious studies committee headed by Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abu Sa'ad al-Sharif. There was also later on a media committee which was run by Abu Musab Reuter. Incidentally, the last name Reuter would have no affiliation with Reuters itself. The media committee would also be later named as Sahab Media. That media committee still exists. According to Al-Fadl, the general emir was Osama bin Laden. The group would be called Al-Qaeda, the base, which was directed from al-Masada. The document had to be signed, declaring unwavering loyalty, bayat, to Osama bin Laden. It was not known at this time what the primary focus of jihad was towards, as bin Laden was in Kandahar, Afghanistan, after his release from a house arrest in Saudi Arabia later on. The initial beginnings of this group can be traced back to the Arabs, but the ideology would later change. And I think this is absolutely important here in this discussion to tell you that the initial operations of Al-Qaeda was not about international terrorism. Now, according to Ann Stemmerson, who wrote the book Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, there was a contentious question regarding these camps that were operated by Al-Qaeda, whether they were actually terrorist training camps. But as far as it is known through the public record, none of the training offered in Al-Qaeda's 8-week basic course at a camp such as Al-Faruq was relevant for conducting terrorist attacks in urban areas or outside Afghanistan. Just a reminder, the Al-Masada training camp was for Arabs who wanted to assist Afghans in their battle against the communist regime in the capital of Kabul in Afghanistan, to repel the Soviets from the country and to let Afghanistan be ruled under the Sharia. The introductions to explosives course at Al-Faruq was not about how to make homemade explosives, but how to use military explosives such as landmines in a guerrilla war setting. Other sources had indicated there were training camps in Afghanistan in the early 1990s that taught skills relevant for carrying out surveillance and assassinations of communist entities. These camps were not mainly run by Al-Qaeda, but other groups such as the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Gamma Islamiyya. These groups had carried out terrorist attacks against the Egyptian regime and most famously killed President Anwar Sadat in Cairo in 1981. Al-Qaeda members initially had taken specialist courses in surveillance as well as fundamentals. For example, such as the Al-Faruq training camp, the first 4 weeks for any person who were training at this camp, in which they would conduct a school called Ta'isa, or from the Arabic translated, the fundamentals. The content in which you would learn throughout the first 4 weeks was weapons theory, small arms fire, introduction to explosives, map reading, and first aid for Afghans and Arabs. The next 2 weeks, the school would be Kuliya, or translated from the Arabic, college, in which you would learn infantry tactics. And finally, in the last 2 weeks, the school of Jahal, or learning from the mountains, in which you would learn heavy weapons firing with mortars, rockets, and anti-aircraft guns. During Operation Cyclone, the CIA operation, they decided to use Stinger missiles and give them to the Afghan Mujahideen and Arabs to shoot down Soviet airplanes and helicopters in which it was used to turn the tide of the war. This would be the most important period in the Afghan-Soviet War. The Reagan administration, under National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, and along with a number of Pentagon officials, thought that this would be an important coalition idea to use Stinger missiles and to give them even to Arab Mujahideen fighters, not knowing the costs of what it would go down just a few short years later. In the spring of 1991, Al-Qaeda was mainly engaged on the front line of Naganar, in which another large battle took place during this period, the Battle of Khost in southern Afghanistan. The Battle of Khost in April, in which followed up with the Battle of Jalalabad in 1989, which was a major failure for bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. However, Al-Qaeda itself would expand outside of Afghanistan. At about this time, I think also to give you some insight into the ideology which changed Al-Qaeda, came from the Egyptians who assimilated into Al-Qaeda, changing the ideology. And it came near the end of the war, in which I have to explain in detail by going back. When the Egyptians had assassinated Sadat in 1980, the groups, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was initially named Al-Jihad, and the Gamma Islamiyah were led by a number of different people. With the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, you had a number of leaders. Ayman al-Zawahiri, Muhammad Abd al-Salam Faraj. Muhammad Abd al-Salam Faraj would write documents such as the Neglected Obligation, which was also called the Neglected Duty. And to reiterate what the Neglected Duty was about, it was a document that was found by Egyptian police when they raided the home of al-Faraj, in which al-Faraj maintained with absolute certainty that jihad would enable Muslims to rule the world and to reestablish the caliphate. His work was denigrated by Sunni theologians, not just in Egypt, but also in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, outside of the extremists called the Wahhabis. Al-Faraj was considered a takfiri. A takfiri was a Muslim who condemned other Muslims as munafiq, translated from the Arabic, a fake Muslim, a Muslim who has committed apostasy, those who do not adhere to the ideology of Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. According to al-Faraj, in the Neglected Duty, on the importance of fighting the near enemy and the far enemy. The near enemy was the Egyptian or the Arab secular governments, in which al-Faraj stated, quote, Muslim blood will be shed in order to realize the victory over Israel. Now it must be asked whether this victory will benefit the interest of infidel rule. It will mean the strengthening of a state which rebels against the laws of God or the Sharia. These rulers will take advantage of the nationalist ideas of these Muslims in order to realize their un-Islamic aims. Even though at the surface these aims look Islamic, fighting has to be done only and under the banner of Islam and under Islamic leadership. The far enemy would be considered Israel and the United States. And according to al-Wahhab, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Muhammad Qasim, and other notable Wahhabi theologians, such as Ayman al-Zawahiri and al-Faraj and bin Laden, the Crusader armies and the Yahud, translated from the Arabic, Israel, the Jew and the United States represented a far enemy. But in order for the far enemy to be defeated, the near enemy had to be defeated first. to create an Islamic caliphate throughout the Arabian Peninsula. However, al-Faraj noted that in order to do this, they needed to overthrow the Hosni Mubarak government in Egypt, which was an outright failure. Notably that this would take time, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri was released from the jails of Al-Turab prison in Egypt and entered the Afghan war at the Red Crescent Hospital in Pakistan, where he would meet with Dr. Fadl and other Egyptian military commanders such as Abu Hafs al-Masri, Abu Ubaidah al-Bashiri. Ayman al-Zawahiri associated with bin Laden and saw the massive influence of using his funding, using his money to conduct his nefarious agenda, which was learned from al-Faraj. Later, Ayman al-Zawahiri would manipulate bin Laden in order to use his army, his training camps, to conduct a far enemy approach to go to war against the United States and Israel without defeating the secular Arab armies of the near enemy approach. This ideology would shape Al-Qaeda later on, but the initial ideology itself would take time. And that's not the course of this discussion. I could talk about that later. I didn't want to make this a very complex discussion. I'm hoping that, as of right now, you're following. During the year of the Soviet-Afghan War, the Soviets agreed to leave Afghanistan and leave Kabul, while Pakistan acted as a mediator. There were rumors that were beginning to denigrate Abdullah Yusuf Azam as the head of the Maktab al-Kidmat, which was now being infiltrated by the Arabs and the Takfiris of Egypt, in which Azam's primary ideology in using the Maktab al-Kidmat as well as Abdullah Nas to use it as an Afghan and Arab staging point to teach Arabs and Afghans about the essence of Islam and training Afghans and Arabs to fight against a secular invader in Russia. Al-Zawahiri and bin Laden now dominated the Maktab al-Kidmat in Pakistan, and later on, Omar Abdel Rahman, a primary emir of Gamma Islamiyah in Egypt, in which he now began to dominate the Al-Farouk Mosque and the Al-Kifa Refugee Center, which was headed by Mustafa al-Shalabi. Rahman had begun to spread rumors about Mustafa Shalabi. Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri began to spread rumors about Abdullah Yusuf Azam, saying he was a spy for Pakistan and the CIA. Meanwhile, millions and millions of dollars began to it was still trickling down into the Maktab al-Kidmat. Now, one thing I want to say is that there are rumors by other people saying that bin Laden is a CIA asset, that his name is Tim Osman, that he was somehow given direct funding to the CIA. This is not true. According to Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri in his book, Nights Under the Prophet's Banner, he dispelled these myths, saying that this is actually rumors, conspiracies that were spread by the West to denigrate bin Laden as nothing more as an asset for the West. And that's coming from one of the emirs of Al-Qaeda, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. And if you want to say that he too is a product of the conspiracy, well, you could go right ahead, and it would be just as ridiculous. Not to say that some of this funding that was coming from the CIA or Saudi Arabia or Pakistan had a trickle-down effect that saw go to Arab elements that were affiliated with Al-Qaeda. That much could be true, and I wouldn't necessarily argue against that position. On November 24th, 1989, Abdullah Azam was assassinated by a bomb in Pakistan. 2 years later, on February 25th, 1991, Mustafa Shalabi was assassinated or killed, and his murder has still yet to be resolved. A number of people would be involved with the murders of both men, including Osama bin Laden and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, as well as the Pakistan ISI, the Israeli Mossad, the CIA. To the death of Azam and to the death of Mustafa Shalabi, Omar Abdul Rahman, and the associates of the Al Farouk Mosque. But what this did was, and most importantly, was that with the death of Azam and the death of Shalabi, both the Maktab al-Kidmat, the group of Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qiba Refugee Center, and as well as the offices that were linked to the Maktab al-Kidmat in Arizona, in New York City, were now headed by the Egyptians and the Takfiris and Osama bin Laden. And the ideology and the tautology of the initial al-Masada camp had now turned from a training camp to help in the resistance against the communists, now an ideology and tautology that were from the al-Faraj neglected duty of the far enemy, near enemy approach that now was taught to the Arabs of Al-Qaeda. Immediately after the expulsion of the Soviets of Afghanistan in 1991 or 1990, the threat of Iraq to invade Saudi Arabia, which was nothing more than a propaganda theory from the CIA. Bin Laden, who recently returned to Saudi Arabia from Afghanistan, had conveyed a meeting along with Prince Turki bin Faisal, the head of the Saudi intelligence, and as well as heading a meeting with the King of Saudi Arabia and his committee, in which he would use the Afghan Mujahideen and the Arab fighters to repel the Iraqi Ba'athist Army. The idea was rejected, and instead the Saudi kingdom invited the United States, another secular invader, to continue a presence in the most holiest sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina. This inflamed and enraged bin Laden, who was placed under house arrest, and his assets were frozen. According to Gerald Posner, an author, bin Laden was allowed to leave Saudi Arabia with his money and supporters, but the Saudi government would publicly disown him. And it was met with the head of the General Intelligence Directorate, Prince Turki al-Faisal, who unfroze his assets and gave him back his passport. Bin Laden sent emissaries to the Sudan and met with the National Islamic Front leader, Hassan al-Turabi, who was a sympathizer for Osama bin Laden. Sudan also at the time was also the only country on earth that didn't have a requirement for a passport to enter the country. And in doing so, in 1991, Osama bin Laden and the Takfiris of Egypt, like Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, Jamal al-Fadl, and Dr. Fadl, Saeed Imam al-Sharif, who would have a major influence along with the ideology of Ayman al-Zawahiri, and he would write an Islamic document that would become a document that would be the shaping of terrorist groups in the future, in which it would be used also to influence Al Qaeda in the Sudan. And the name of that document is called The Essentials of Making Ready for Jihad, which was used as a jihad manual in the training camps in Afghanistan in the early 1990s and in the Sudan, in which Al Qaeda would later now be known as a terrorist organization, in which the Western intelligence services of the CIA began to monitor. And I think I'm going to stop there because what I wanted to do was give you the initial years of Al Qaeda and how they transformed from initially into an Arab base to help repel the Soviets from Afghanistan, and later to be used as a springboard for international terrorism, which was influenced by the Egyptians and the Saudis and Arabs affiliated with Saudi Arabia and Osama bin Laden. And so, what I'll do now is I will open it up for questions for the audience, that anybody who's here. And so, if anybody has questions, I will open it up. Um, Sean, please.
Hey, am I coming through okay?
Yeah, you are, sir.
Okay, great. I thought it was great, Adam. Good talk. You purposefully avoided a little bit about ideology, so I figured I'd fill in the gap there a little bit by bringing up what you basically alluded to regarding the Egyptian influence. And I think there's probably something said about the Pakistani influence and the Sudanese influence, but regarding just the Egyptians, what comes to mind is that prominent Egyptian Islamic Jihad member Ayman al-Zawahiri has been cited as a major influence on bin Laden's ideology and the formation of Al Qaeda, even being described as the brains behind bin Laden. And he, like the blind sheikh, Omar Abdel Rahman, the convicted seditious terrorism conspirator of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and also the father of Salafi jihadism and inspiration of Muhammad Abdul al-Faraj, Said Qutb, all had been imprisoned in Egypt where they were tortured. It's been suggested that the brutal conditions of Egyptian prison further radicalized these influencers and hardened their Islamic attitudes towards militancy and political violence, which would include acted assassinations and even terrorism. A striking example of this prison phenomenon might be Abu Musab al Zarqawi, the Jordanian militant who, drawing on the anti American sentiment of some Iraqis ever since the first Iraq War, and especially during the coalition invasion after 9/11, and incidentally or ironically, the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, was the founder of Al Qaeda in Iraq, which becomes ISIS. But before heeding the call of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, Zarqawi was a common criminal, an alcoholic pimp and street thug known for getting in fights and for having his body covered in tattoos, such that he earned the nickname the Green Man. And he had made many militant Salafist connections over a number of years in Pakistan, but was ultimately arrested with guns and explosives and imprisoned in Jordan, whereafter he attempted to form cells of prisoners and, like the others aforementioned, becomes even more radical. And despite not finishing an education at school during his youth while imprisoned, Zarqawi became Hafiz, someone who has memorized the entire Quran. And according to Jordanian journalist Fouad Hussein, who knew Zarqawi in prison, it was not the Afghan jihad, but rather the torture in prison which radicalized Zarqawi. So historically, these incarcerations seem to be a real factor in who becomes a terrorist and why. Convicted American felon Edward Bunker called prison the animal factory in his novel of the same name, and with reportedly some 76% of US prisoners being rearrested within 5 years of release, and in the worst case prisons, as much as 80% of the populations being gang affiliated. The effects seem almost like a blowback, much like the violent responses to Western imperialist policy in the Middle East. When American independent contractor Nick Berg was beheaded by al Zarqawi in Iraq in 2004, Berg's father perhaps wisely indicated that he would not be seeking revenge for the loss of his son because revenge is what causes the violent cycle to perpetuate. So much the way the United States seems to be routinely creating problems for itself to solve, resulting from foreign policy decisions, the criminal corrections systems of harsh imprisonments are creating more crime to correct as well, even more terrorists. And with the United States military aggression and torture and prisoner abuse left, right, and center when it comes to Middle East terrorist blowback, it's perhaps fitting that former Angola officer John Stockwell entitled his first book on the CIA In Search of Enemies. That's all. Thanks.
Yes, and you know what? Thank you for that, by the way, because that's true. And you know, I'll say this much is that it's very much true that the initial founders of some of these groups, like Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Wild Jihad al Tawhid, which later became the Islamic State in Levant and Islamic State of Iraq, these individuals were tortured unmercilessly, or they learned their tautology from influential imams. With Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, it came from Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who's considered one of the most dangerous Muslims in the world. He's an imam out of Jordan. But yes, all these individuals basically either were facing dire circumstances in prison by torture. In fact, Dr. al-Zawahiri was mercilessly tortured, but Omar Abdul Rahman was not because he was blind. But later on, these individuals would later form some of the most dangerous groups on the earth, as well as people that would become under their tautology, manipulated due to foreign policy of the United States. It's shaping itself up. And I think with the initial foundation of Al Qaeda itself, this is often misunderstood because hardly anyone ever talks about this. You'll always hear the State Department talking points about how Al Qaeda is always a terrorist organization. Well, that's not true. And just when you look at the history of Al Qaeda itself, they themselves were basically, as I outlined in the talk, that they were just a training camp for Arabs itself because there were no Arab training camps in Afghanistan, and that they would help to repel the Soviets in Afghanistan itself. So, is there any other questions regarding this topic at all? I think there's 5 other people. Maybe there isn't. Maybe there is not. Maybe there's no interest. I can understand why. It's a very expansive issue because I could have talked about Al Qaeda after they relocate to Sudan, and then Al Qaeda in Afghanistan when they go back in 1996, and that's when they begin terrorist operations by employing the fatwas that were conducted in 1996, 98. Probably what I'll do is in the next Twitter Space, I'll talk about that, the after effects of that in 1996. Hey, Sean, go ahead.
So I recall seeing from some source, and I haven't been able to confirm who it was, but some years ago, I recall seeing that I believe it was an American intelligence officer had said in an interview that the first time they saw the name Al Qaeda come across their desk was perhaps in 1989. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about when the West starts to become aware of a thing that could be called Al Qaeda. Is it with Ali Muhammad, who you spoke briefly about? who I believe he had manuals or something, right? He was like the American man to explain what Al Qaeda is, but he was also the Al Qaeda man to learn what America is. Is that where the West meets East regarding something that we call Al Qaeda? Thanks.
Yeah, sure, Sean. I'll speak on this. I think there's going to be some differences of the time frame of where the name Al Qaeda became known to the West or the United States in the intelligence services. Now, of course, Sean, I'm pretty sure you're quite familiar about Ahmadinejad's documents in which he had Al Qaeda manual or an Al Qaeda. The name Al Qaeda was on a document, and that became the first time that was known that the name Al Qaeda was known to the United States itself. So I would submit to you that probably the first time Al Qaeda was mentioned by the West was through the CIA. Now, to the FBI in 1995, they inquired to the CIA about a financier named Osama bin Laden. Now, the FBI, basically counterterrorism in New York, had not known about bin Laden until after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, in which Frank Pellegrino, a counterterrorism agent out of the I-49 unit, was first to make the link between Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the bombing of the 1990 World Trade Center bombing, in which he sent $600 through a wire transfer to Mohammed Salame, who was connected to the bombing. And New York basically didn't know anything about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or Osama bin Laden. So they asked the CIA to share any details about this individual, bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And what the CIA provided was 40 files, thick binders of bin Laden and Al Qaeda. Now, I would submit to you that investigation went far beyond 1990, no less. I can't tell you because there is no definitive account about when the CIA became aware of Al Qaeda. The timings are going to be very obscure, whether it was 1990, 1989, maybe even 1988. But what we know from the Tariq Osama documents, these are the earliest documents that we have in public, but unfortunately they're in Arabic and they're not translated to English. But if you look at the Harmony documents, which I would take with a grain of salt, these are the documents that were recovered from bin Laden's bookshelf in Pakistan. But I would submit to you that if you can, and if you know anybody who speaks Arabic, the Tariq Osama documents are the documents to read, because this became known to the West, along with Jamal al-Fawz's testimony, which was provided to the federal prosecutors, Patrick Fitzgerald, in their suit against Osama bin Laden, that the West became known about Al-Qaeda somewhere between 1988 to 1991. But the definitive date is really not known. So I think if you ask my opinion, I think the first agency to know about Al-Qaeda was the CIA. But probably the first, talking about the first agency outside of the West, it would be the ISI or the GID, because they dealt directly with the Arabs. The CIA did not. That's why I made it an important point to note that the CIA was not allowed in Afghanistan, but they were allowed to direct funding, direct munitions and weapons and whatnot through the ISI in Pakistan. Gary, please go ahead. You're on mute, Gary.
Hi, Adam. Thank
Hey,
you.
Gary.
This is a great talk. Little off topic, but close. Osama never admitted to orchestrating the attacks. There's just a sketchy video that was released of him sitting in a cave, alluding to them, which some people like myself believe could have been manipulated or created. And KSM's admissions were all under torture. So again, I don't take the official evidence as conclusive, and I tend to think the CIA and other intelligence agencies curated Al Qaeda and guided and potentially influenced the events of 9/11? Thanks.
Sure. Hey, Gary, let me entertain that for you a bit, right? So Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin Al-Shib in 2002 were in a safe house in Pakistan. And what happened was they got in contact with a journalist from Al Jazeera in London, and his name was Yoshri Fuda. Now, I'm the only person to ever interview Nick Fielding regarding the book Masterminds of Terror, in which Al-Qaeda reached out to the committee, the Sahab media arm, to Yoshri Fuda, who's an Arab speaker and a very reputable person, in which Khalid Sheikh Mohammed wanted to be interviewed by an Arab journalist. And so Yoshri Fuda had to go through many security protocols. He had to go to live in a house for 2 or 3 days in which he was watched so he wouldn't be followed. And Yoshri Fuda actually is the only person in the world to ever interview Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin Al-Shib in Pakistan. And this is before they were captured. This is before they were tortured. And they admitted to their role with 9/11. Now, I'll submit to you that the videotape that was collected, that was found, the infamous confession video that was found by U.S. forces in Jalalabad, Pakistan. The video itself looks sketchy, right? Bin Laden is there, and other individuals such as Suleiman Abu Ghaith, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, as well as a Saudi, Khalid al-Harbi. Now, if you're going to say that all these people are fakes or that they're actors made to look like these individuals, Al-Qaeda this is an infamous, this is a very infamous tape that's known throughout the world. Al-Qaeda has never came out and denigrated saying that that tape was fake. So just take that in mind, that Al-Qaeda never said that that tape was fake. And also, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri himself has repeatedly, he's still alive, he just did a video recently. He has publicly stated, even after bin Laden was assassinated, that they never disavowed that they were involved with the plane's operation of September 11, 2001. Bin Laden himself has even done interviews with Taysir Alawani, who's from Al Jazeera as well, in 2002, where he basically tells him that he is a terrorist, that the plane's operation was approved by him. Now, here's the thing, Gary. Bin Laden didn't construct the September 11th operation. He was given a minor role in selecting the pilots. But the operation itself was created by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. This is often twisted by the media in the United States as saying bin Laden is behind 9/11. But just remember, when 9/11 was happening, nobody, and I mean hardly anyone, even inside the CIA, knew who Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was. They knew him as Mukhtar, which was a nickname that was given to him. Very few people knew who he was, outside of Frank Pellegrino, outside of probably, say, George Tenet, the DCI. Very few people knew who Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was. And when the FBI went to interrogate, goodness gracious, the first Al-Qaeda commander that they captured, and his name is going to, goodness gracious. Boo, I forgot his name. Well, the FBI interrogated him. Ali Soufan was the first person to interrogate him, and he showed him pictures of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and he said Mukhtar. He pointed out, said Mukhtar. How do you know Mukhtar was behind 9/11? And Ali Soufan had no idea. And he said, we always knew he was behind 9/11, and he gave him information. Meanwhile, Ali Soufan went to a hallway and spoke with an associate of his and said, oh my God, who's the hell is Mukhtar? They found out it was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And by then, in 2002 and onwards, people started to begin who Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was. And then after he was captured, yes, you're right, Gary, they tortured him. And even if he told the truth, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because it was through torture. It was done to duress. Even if he told the truth, we still have to think that maybe he was lying just to stop the truth. And I think that, and this is my opinion, Gary, I think that's the reason why the CIA did that. Was that so that the public itself could never make a definitive and know for sure that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was behind 9/11. As long as we're left in a state of paralysis, in a state of disbelief, we'll never make a real true decision on whether he was telling the truth or not. Sean, go ahead, sir.
Wow, great question and answer. I think this is where you've really gotten into the conundrum. One of the more important anomalies. See, we're talking about operational capability or proof of involvement, and we're also talking about Pakistan as well as their National Intelligence Service. So you've already explained how al-Masada is basically guerrilla warfare. They could be perceived as terrorists, I suppose, but their operational capabilities are not impressive or grandiose. And when you have the figure who is, even by the official narrative, far more mysterious and shadowy than even a bin Laden, is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, to the point where we can't even be certain where he was born or when. He's got multiple aliases. And he has a modus operandi which is arguably superior to what a bin Laden would be known for. Even if bin Laden had any amount of bravery, maybe he's got some money, but he doesn't do the kinds of things that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed did. Just for example, you mentioned using basic military explosives, handguns. Well, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed seems to be from Pakistan, has got a Baluchi background, apparently. And his tight group, well, they use sophisticated liquid bombs and other far more complex, and their schemes are much bigger than anything that Al-Qaeda did in the early days, fighting against the Soviets, or even when their ideology is redirected. So it's, I think, important, as I mentioned, to talk about the ideology, but a valuable component of this talk is also just the operational capabilities. And you could look at also, as well, it goes really well in understanding this, is just the structure of what we basically call Al-Qaeda is not a hierarchical organization. They have the emir, which is ideological direction. But when it comes to actual operations, it's a networked structure. And there's many cells which associate to a degree with each other. And when you get Khalid Sheikh Mohammed getting dropped into the mix by probably 1997, 1996, there's some argument that we've retroactively associated his group to bin Laden's group before then. But again, with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, there's so much conflicting information. So I think it's great that we got to bring it back to Pakistan. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, Sean, this is really important that you raised, because a lot of people tend to associate Al-Qaeda as basically bin Laden and Arabs itself. But when you could see the evolution of Al-Qaeda, example, right? With Al-Qaeda, you saw an evolution of its exogenesis, of its operations, its analytics, its essence itself. And what we saw was from basically a guerrilla training camp that turned into a multi-international terrorist organization. And this came from not just bin Laden itself. And I didn't mention this before, but there were many sympathizers in Saudi Arabia that sympathized with bin Laden and the ideology and the idea that the United States was stationed in Saudi Arabia. So also, there were other Saudi dissidents as well in the country, as well as the kingdom. And I need to mention this as well, is that the kingdom basically paid what it amount to blackmail money to Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that are affiliated with it, like Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines and Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia. Is that these groups are basically affiliates with Al-Qaeda. Now, remember, there was a brother-in-law, Jamal al-Khalifa, who's married to one of the sisters of bin Laden, who's operating businesses in the Philippines, who has connections with Abu Sayyaf, a terrorist group over there. And that group basically was conducting operations under the guise of Al Qaeda, the umbrella of Al Qaeda. Now, we saw one of the biggest terrorist operations outside of September 11th, which was the Bali bombings of 2002. And that basically was an extension of Al Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf. And I did a whole article about that, and I did video about that as well, which you can see on my YouTube channel. And hardly anyone mentions that, as well as, the operations involving urea nitrate, which I'm glad you brought this up, Sean. Where did this operation of urea nitrate come from? Well, it didn't come from Al Qaeda. It came from Pakistan, the Baluchistan clan of Abdul Basit Al Karim, also known as Hamza Yusuf, and his uncle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who has also an uncle relating to the Pakistan ISI and the government of Pakistan. And many people think that the Pakistan government is basically run by the ISI, which is basically probably one of the oldest and most nefarious agencies in the world. Up until this point, no ISI operative has ever been captured, which is remarkable in its own right when you think about it. No whistleblower has ever come out from the ISI. Now, there's been some whistleblowers from the CIA, yes, but not from the ISI. It's a state within a state, as it's latterly called. And the nefarious issue of Pakistan, the ISI, as well as foreign domestic agencies like the Israeli Mossad or the Saudi GID or maybe even the British MI6, could they have infiltrated with Al Qaeda in these training camps after 1996? Damn straight. I believe that was the case. But did the CIA infiltrate these camps? I don't know. Now, according to Cofer Black, he was appalled when he was who was head of the Counterterrorism Center in 1999. He was appalled that the CIA didn't have any operatives in Al Qaeda. And that was later on the reasoning for not informing the FBI about Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi inside the United States, because they wanted to make them informants of Al Qaeda. Now, I would submit to you, why didn't the CIA basically go to the Mossad through the covert group, which basically is now escaping me, or to the GID, or to the Mukhabarat in Jordan or in Lebanon? Why didn't they go to the ISI and basically say, hey, can you infiltrate these groups and share the information with us? Because they got Arabic speakers and they could pass off as Al Qaeda operatives inside Al Qaeda. Ayman Dean wrote a book, 9 Lives, where basically he was acting. He was an Al Qaeda operative, and later on became an informant for the British MI6, and he met with Bin Laden and Abu Hafs al-Masri, Mohammed Atef. And so it wasn't like these people are very hard to infiltrate. It's now a matter of knowing it. We can believe that they've been infiltrated, and they have been infiltrated, according to certain people who went on to write books about it. But do we know at the level how many people have infiltrated that group? And I'm not talking about, when I talk about infiltration, I'm talking about information collecting, data collecting. Data which can be used to manipulate an operation before they happen. And I think this is absolutely imperative to tell you, is that something like September 11, 2001, in which I have alluded ad nauseum that domestic agencies like the NSA and the CIA had collected information prior to the September 11th events, which could have prevented September 11th if they shared it. And that's coming from whistleblowers of the CIA, out of the NSA and the FBI. But what was known to them that isn't known right now? According to Thomas Drake, the NSA alone said that they had so much metadata, they could have stopped 9/11 altogether. Just them alone. Now, just imagine what the CIA had. Just imagine what the Mossad had. Just imagine what the Saudis had. You get what I'm coming from? All these agencies, whether they were acting in accordance with one another or separate from one another, they probably had a massive amount of information. It's not about a lack of information, because guess who used that excuse? The CIA, the FBI, the directors, Mueller, Tennant, Hayden from the NSA. You know what they said? We didn't have the manpower. We didn't have the information. Where basically the opposite was true. They had an enormous amount of information, an enormous amount of metadata. I'm not even bringing up Able Danger, which was an operation headed by the Department of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Department of the U.S. Army. Thousands of people that were involved with these operations, foreign and domestic, that could have had information, that could have prevented 9/11. What does that mean? That means that they allowed the attacks to happen. Now, look, that's speculation. I don't have information, but I can make a damn good argument about it. Gary, go ahead, sir.
Adam, a thought came to mind. Is there an Arabic 9/11 truth movement? And have books and studies been published in Arabic by Arabic-speaking folks that want to clear their own country's reputations potentially? Because there's so much blame was pinned on Islam in general after 9/11. You would think there'd be a huge movement to clarify and substantiate some of these things, and there are still living folks over there that may have been involved or knew the potential hijackers.
This is an important question, Gary, and I'd like to elaborate a little bit. Now, according to this is coming from a directive, like foreign policy mandates. And I think I've explained this in other Twitter spaces. I think the first Twitter space I've done, I spoke about foreign policy outlines like the Wolfowitz Doctrine, Defense Planning Guideline, which was renamed to the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the Oded Yinon Plan. These are foreign policy outlets known to you and everybody in the room. Later on, Project for New American Century, and then later on the Bush Doctrine, okay? The foreign policy guidelines, which allowed for to use the intelligence apparatus to collect information, to take advantage of operations like September 11th, or like the 1993 World Trade Center bomb, or Cobra Towers, to implement regulations, to implement foreign policy outlines, regulations and laws, and later on institute regulations and laws that go against the civil liberties of everyday Americans and people around the world. And who's to blame? Well, like Gary, as you said, the Islamic world. To the State Department, this is a war on terrorism. What does that even mean, right? It's such a vague term. Well, if you go back to the weeks after 9/11, what did the National Security Council do? White House lawyers such as John Yoo or David Attenborough, they created some of the most dangerous and nefarious legislation in U.S. history, which bypassed the Geneva Conventions and even the Department of Justice. And what they wrote was a memo for detainees labeled enemy combatants. Now, that was under Department of Justice jurisdiction to label who's an enemy combatant. Well, under these new memos, they basically bypassed the Department of Justice and said the president makes that decision. Well, what's an enemy combatant? Is it a terrorist? Is it an Arab terrorist? Is it a Muslim? No, it could be anybody. That means you and me if we oppose the state. Do you see the danger in this? You got to think of it like how foreign policy analysts do. They look at 20, 30 years down the line. We don't. We worry about the now because, we got to pay rent. We got to get, electric on. What if our kids go hungry? We're not thinking 20 years, 30. These people are. And they create the legislation that harms not just Muslims, but to the world over. Now, look, after the September 11th attacks, who were the biggest victims of September 11th wars? Muslims in general. According to these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who were the biggest victims of those groups of Wahhabi Islam? Muslims. Who were the biggest victims of these foreign policy guidelines made by Israel and the neoconservatives, the think tank like the Project New American Century? Muslims, Arabs. But guess who we didn't go to war with? Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar. The entities, the essence, Egypt. The essence of all these Wahhabi groups. No, we went to war with Shia groups such as Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. Okay? Lebanon. Why did we go to war with these countries? Iran, which is the looming war. Why did we go to war with these countries? Well, these are fulfilling foreign policy guidelines of the early 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Hey, Special Ed, go ahead there, pal. Oh, I thought you wanted to speak. I thought you had your hand raised. Oh, my fault. But yeah, if you had a question, Special Ed, I'll let you come. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Adam. Great talk, as always. I'm going to keep this brief because I'm taking care of my toddler. I was wondering if you could maybe expand on, there were some interesting ties with Timothy McVeigh and KSM, I believe, in the Philippines. And that kind of ties into your conversation about, policy being set and et cetera, because the OKC bombing was kind of pivotal in some of the rights restricting legislation that got passed afterwards. Anyway, thank you once again.
Yeah. Hey, Ed, I hate to not. This is like I can't answer that question. I'll tell you why. I wanted to do a Twitter space based on the Pachinko plot. So, and that's definitely one of the questions I would definitely answer regarding that. I was going to do that next week. So you're reading my mind. I don't know how you're doing it, but yeah, sorry. But what I'll do, later on. So I won't give a very descriptive answer. I'll give a vague response to that because I don't want to not answer your question. So what happened was in 1995, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Youssef, 1993, 94, they traveled to the Philippines. And what happened was that they met with Mohammed Jamil Khalifa, who's the son-in-law or the brother-in-law of Osama bin Laden, and they helped they were working with Abu Sayyaf, and Ramzi Youssef was training them to make bombs. And the story that you're referring to is not Timothy McVeigh, so to speak, but Terry Nichols. And this is not a conspiracy because this is actually reported by Richard Clarke in his book Against All Enemies, in which he's the counterterrorism czar under Clinton and the Bush administrations, in which he says that in the weeks prior to the Oklahoma City bombing, Terry Nichols, who's married to a Filipino wife, actually went to Cebu City, in which she was from, and Terry Nichols was seen with another individual, and that's Timothy McVeigh, and they were seen in the same city as Ramzi Youssef. And the reason, and this is coming from the testimony of a confidential informant who is also a terrorist. And I did a video about him and I wrote an article about him called Edwin Angelines, who is a member of the Philippines National Army. And he went by Ibrahim Yusuf, who was a terrorist. He actually was conducting hijacking operations and bombings of Christian churches. And he killed people. And people didn't think, they didn't know what to make of him, whether he was an informant or a terrorist. But he was actually both. But he was there when Terry Nichols met with Ramzi Youssef, and they had a nickname for him called the Farmer. Richard Clarke is going by that briefing of that Philippines informant and said that that after Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh left the Philippines, they built what? What did they build? A urea nitrate bomb. And where did they store this bomb? In a yellow Ryder truck. Does that sound familiar? Well, what was the nature of the bomb used in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing? Urea nitrate, located in a yellow Ryder truck. Is that coincidence? No. Now, also, just to mention, you mentioned Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed also traveled to the Philippines and they were doing the Pachinko plot. I'm not going to get into that because I want to do a Twitter space dedicated to that. And I think that's the essence of the September 11th attacks, which came from the Pachinko plot itself. So I won't mention anything more about that. But yes, Special Ed, yes, that was an interesting story indeed. So, yeah. Any other questions regarding tonight's discussion? We have 6 people here. I saw John Gold in here, but he had to leave. But if we don't have any more questions, I can end it. And that would be the end of the discussion. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. Okay, Gary, you got a question. Go ahead, Pedro. You're on mute, Gary. There you go. Well, you're on mute again. There you go.
Okay. Speaking of John Gold, I wanted to ask about where's the unity in the sane 9/11 truth movement? There was a thread of earlier this week trying to get John Gold involved in one of these, and if you guys could work together, I mean, we could make some progress here. There's a handful of people doing solid research like you, John, thermal detonator, Darren, Sean. So I just want to issue a call for unity amongst the sane 9/11 researchers. That's it.
Oh, Gary. Hey, by the way, I don't know if this was known to you, but yeah, I just got into a very pleasant discussion that was facilitated by Mike Garofalo. He's in here. Thanks to him, that he got me involved with like a phone discussion on Google, I think, with John Gold, and I haven't spoken to him in about a year and a half, and it was a really great discussion. And listen, John Gold is one of the OGs of 9/11 itself. He's been around since the very beginning, way back, and he's done some magnificent work. Even though me and him were at we weren't talking for about a year and a half. I've always referred to John Gold as one of the primary influences regarding myself and others. I've never had a bad word to say about John Gold. I never will. He's not alone. I think there's other researchers that I wish were still operational, like Paul Thompson, who I consider, I think, one of the greatest of all time. Kevin Fenton, another person who's around, but he's not as active, Ray Nowolski. I could name a couple of others, but very few. Ryan Dawson is another, but he's banned everywhere he goes. The only person that is active is, DJ Thermal Detonator, Nelson Martins. And now we have Sean Russell and Darren Harvey, and they're going to be doing a podcast and they're doing videos. And the more rational people. I agree, Gary. The more rational people and the more coalition between us would be beneficial. We have so much, and this is something just really it grinds my gears, so to speak, that we see so many fringe conspiracy theorists like Christopher Bolin and Rebecca Roth, and I hate to use the names, but they sullied 9/11, and whenever people talk about 9/11, you get there's this collective like groan about it. It's almost like, oh man, because they automatically refer to like those no planes and no hijackers or fake phone calls, and that's not what we're about. Some of us, and what we're trying to do is bring back some legitimacy into discussions in the hope of creating a new movement of rational people involving the old faces like John Gold and maybe Ray Nowolski and Paul Thompson. But I'm afraid we lost some of those people because of the simple fact that the fringe conspiracy movement has really fractured and basically destroyed the 9/11 truth movement as a whole. But is it lost forever? No, I don't think so. I think there are some people in the 9/11 truth movement that are worth saving, and that the movement is worth saving. So, I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and say, I hope it dies 1,000 deaths. No, I think what we need to do is clean house, so to speak, and get rid of the fringe conspiracy theorists and implement people like John Gold and Paul Thompson and DJ Thermal Detonator and make them work together and bring back legitimacy so we can hold people responsible for, whatever their parts in allowing or constructing 9/11 itself. So that's what I believe. Maybe is it a pipe dream? Yeah, I don't think so. And what gives me hope is we have young people like Matt Garofalo and Sean Russell and Darren Harvey and Special Ed and you yourself, Gary, and MG Dunn. I know all of you. I know what you guys post every day and what you do, and you're valuable. No, make no mistake. It's not an exaggeration when I say it. You're invaluable in that you're the voices that are going to be much more heard than myself. And Brian Dawson and DJ Third Detonator, because you're going to be able to reach a bigger audience than I ever could. And that's what I believe. And so as long as you're active, as long as you're interested, as long as you come to these talks and listen, to people like myself and others, you yourself are going to reach a bigger audience in the future. And that's what I hope to do. And that's one of my goals, was creating that podcast I made and with Richard Cox and doing these talks, is that, it's great that you follow me, but I don't want you to be a follower. I want you to be a leader. And I want you to lead the movement to higher heights than I ever could. And that's how you build a movement, Gary, is that you have an informed audience that can reach a bigger audience. And that's how you build a movement. And I hope that that makes sense to you. But if there's no more questions, I can end it here. And then, I didn't do one last week. And because I went to visit a friend. And but I could do one next weekend, and what I'll do is the Pachinko plot. Or did I do that? No, wait a minute. I did that. I'm losing my mind. Wow, I just did a lecture on the Pachinko plot on Twitter Spaces. My God. But what I'll do is, Sean, go ahead, pal. Maybe you can remind me. Yeah, go ahead.
Here we go. Special ed, you were asking about KSM in the Philippines. And if we needed to round off anything else to talk about Bojinka, I think the important stuff about Bojinka is not so much Bojinka for today, but maybe the surrounding stories of the incident that was the foiling of the Bojinka plot, because KSM and his network involving his nephew and his nephew's accomplices, they were operating in Southeast Asia at that time. And KSM was worldwide. He got around, even into some countries that were known for their counterterrorism security, and even getting into some places that he probably shouldn't have been able to. And I'd say that the important thing to know about KSM in the Philippines, Terry Nichols could have learned how to make bombs there, but KSM and his associates, they celebrated the anniversary of the downing of Pan Am 103. That's all.
Yeah. Hey, listen, Sean, I'm going to let Gary speak and follow up on that. I think you were directing it to him anyway. Go ahead, Gary.
I just have a topic request. Maybe the discussion on how the buildings 1 and 2 could have come down. If you could go into detail on the guys working on the elevators, the sprinklers, the driver's license scandal. That whole story is really interesting and hasn't been covered in great detail.
Oh my God, Gary! I'm like the worst person to talk about physics, and I say this all the time too. Like I always tell people, when it comes to like what happened in World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7, I could give you an opinion, but it's based on nothing more than an uneducated opinion. And you could talk to David Chandler about Wayne Costi, but I'm terrible with that. But with the license, that Catherine Smith story about the Tennessee 5, that would be, oh my God, I would be terrible for that. Yeah, I would be, Gary, I would be terrible. That's just being honest. Like, I would not be very good for that type of lecture. So if you wanted an opinion, I could do that, but it would be a very short discussion. Like, I couldn't tell you. Yeah, I would be terrible for that. But yeah, Gary, shoot. I hate to say no, I can't, but I really, I don't think it would be a very productive discussion. And usually I would like to I only want to talk about things that I can know something. And I don't know. Like, I believe bombs were used in World Trade Center, 1 and 2. Especially 1 and 2, to ensure that they came down, right? But do I know it? I don't. right? Because I haven't done the necessary learning about engineering or physics or even demolitions. And yeah, I could give you an opinion, Gary, but it won't help you. And these lectures, when I do these talks, it's not for me; it's for you because I want you to come away with something. I would be horrified if nobody in this room basically didn't do their due diligence and like researched things that I say today. I'm hoping that some of you, or I'm hoping all of you anyway, but I'm hoping that some of you basically say, hey, I didn't hear about that. Let me go and research it myself. Just to make sure that what you learned, that you know is information. Because I don't want you to believe me. I want you to know something. Right? And that's the difference between, say, myself and fringe conspiracy theorists. Because I want you to become leaders, not followers. I don't want you to be followers. I want you to be leaders. I want you to write your own articles, to do your own videos in the future. So that's what I want you to come away with. Yeah, but Gary, speaking about that, I would be the worst person to speak about how they came down. I would be terrible. Sean, go ahead, pal.
So I'll take a stab at this, Adam. Gary, regarding usually we say controlled demolition or however you want to nickname this concept, right? Did the hijacked airplanes have a little help in destroying world trade? That's basically what this conversation is about here. With that, there's just not much in the way of tangible evidence. So it's a really speculative area. It's like bullet physics with JFK or something. Like it's a really tangled up, complicated. You got to kind of be a numbers wizard. And even if you are confident that you understand the physics, then there's still going to be contested arguments because there's people on all sides on this thing about whether the buildings had help being brought down. But what I would say is I think we would probably all have to at least recognize that terrorism is psychological warfare, and the psychology of having world trade destroyed has tremendous value from a violent political action standpoint. It's the type of thing that reverberates. And so there's a lot of reason to suspect that any manipulating or predominantly dominant party involved would have an interest in seeing the very, very powerful ripple effect of world trade destroyed. At the same time, I'll say that I've talked to people recently who have personal engineering opinions relayed to them from close friends, and there's people who would even say that the buildings truly didn't need help coming down. And I've heard that from a few different people who are in the field of engineering. And so beyond the bullet physics of it, with the lack of tangible evidence that you can really work with and present at the table in a courtroom, this speculative argument is tough to really get anywhere with. I think that Building 7 is a lot of fun to puzzle, but I got tired of it a while ago. And I think more and more I think what you got to do is you got to go with a couple of names. And so if I'm going to be talking about did the buildings have help? Well, there's two places that I'm going to look, and that's Khalid Odala and Sivan Kurzberg. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, hey, thanks for that, Sean. Yeah, this is the biggest issue for 9/11 truthers, right? 9/11 truth movement is that how the buildings collapsed. Because in the early years of the 9/11 truth movement, the geopolitics was completely overwhelmed by fringe conspiracy theorists. There were very hardly anybody qualified to speak about it. Now, of course, you had, like I said, John Gold, Paul Thompson, Kevin Fenton. Paul Thompson and Kevin Fenton wrote two of the most important books in all of 9/11, and they're hardly ever read. Unfortunately, it's called The Terror Timeline by Paul Thompson, and Kevin Fenton wrote Disconnecting the Dots. Later on, Ray Nowlisky wrote The Watchdogs Didn't Bark. The three most important books in all of 9/11. I would consider The Terrorist Timeline as the most important book on 9/11. If you haven't read it, I would absolutely recommend that book more than anything. What is the problem with the truth movement, I feel, is that by allowing the speculators of the fringe movements to basically become the voice instead of having John Gold or having Paul Thompson, Kevin Fenton in the early 2003, 2004 period, by allowing people who want to speculate about space beams melting the towers or no hijackers on these planes or fake phone calls. The truth movement basically opposed the official narrative at all costs. Now, from my experience, take this with a grain of salt. From my experience, your experience could be different. From my experience, the 9/11 truth movement considered the official narrative as the following: that 4 planes were hijacked by 19 Islamic fundamentalists, and that they crashed into the World Trade Center, Towers 1 and 2, the Pentagon, and into a field in Shanksville. And I think this is probably a very disingenuous label because of the simple fact that that represents a microcosm of the official 9/11 Commission report. There are 14 chapters in that report. It's over 550 pages. And it basically mentions that in just a half a chapter. Did they read the whole chapter? Did they read the rest of the chapters? Now, what I would submit to you is this. The 9/11 Commission report, some of it is true. Some of it is false. But a majority of information is missing that wasn't reported or investigated by the Commission panel. And that is the problem the 9/11 truth movement faces. Because if they're not investigating that which is missing, and if they're not investigating that which they don't believe, hijackers or hijacked planes, guess what they're going to investigate? Ground Zero. And because of this, for the last 18 years, the majority of the 9/11 truth movement has basically gathered at Ground Zero. And they never left, using that as a proverbial thought, that they never left Ground Zero. And some people that we know personally, that's all they talk about. And if you mention a hijacker's name, if you mention Alex Station, if you mention the NSA wiretapping of a Yemen hub in Bin Assad, they'll look at you like a deer in headlights. But this is where the essence of where we could show a real conspiracy involving foreign and domestic intelligence involvement with the attacks. And before it, some of which I alluded to in my very first Twitter space conversation, as well as my second Twitter space conversation involving the Israeli art students and the moving companies. And it's just, it really frustrates me because for 21 years, the groups in the truth movement, such as Truth Action Project, Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, architects and engineers, they allowed the fringe elements to be involved with these movements and basically destroy it from within to the public eye by employing or endorsing the silly theories of no planes, no hijackers, and none of this. And whether you want to say that was intentional or not, I wouldn't disagree with you. But you don't need the CIA right now to destroy the truth movement. They're doing them themselves because they didn't do the responsible thing. They didn't vet the people who were representing the movement and allowed them to espouse these ideas because at least they were against the official narrative. And the official narrative has to be opposed at all costs, no matter how ridiculous the theory is. And right now, as of this point, that is what haunts the 9/11 truth movement. Sean, go ahead, pal.
Here we go.
I lost you, pal.
I'm back in here. So Building 7, we keep coming back to Building 7. And, well, according to the popular memes, your prime suspect with Building 7 is Larry Silverstein. And that's just such a weird way to go about things, because you could have a better link towards finding some kind of accountability with Jerome Hauer. And I'm even guilty of this myself, because Jerome Hauer is like really under-recognized in the truth movement. He was only really brought to my close attention a matter of years ago. And so instead of going at the most Neanderthal approach of trying to put some really grand and obnoxious conspiracy on the table with a name like Larry Silverstein, you could be pointing to Jerome Hauer, because now you've got a link to the death of John O'Neill and the anthrax attacks. Jerome Hauer.
Sure, this is a great point that you raise, and I am guilty of it myself, because I barely mention the name Jerome Hauer, because I don't really, discuss much about the attacks at the World Trade Centers, or the demolition thereof, or the collapse thereof. I study geopolitics. I study intelligence apparatuses, radical fundamentalism, and U.S., Israeli, Saudi foreign policy. That's my area of study. And because of that, is that I don't really talk much about Rudy Giuliani or the offices of the World Trade Center and what's involved with them. The person probably listed to that is Robbie Martin. I think he's the most formidable voice regarding the connections between Giuliani, Jerome Hauer, and Israeli intelligence regarding that. And he's done some magnificent podcasts, including probably one of the best podcasts I ever heard about 9/11, his 5-hour podcast involving the anthrax attacks, which is uploaded to Media Roots Radio. Larry Silverstein is a boring story. Let me tell you why. Is he suspicious? 100%. I think this guy's gotten written intelligence all over his face. But is it demonstrably true? Can we prove it? No. I mean, it's suspicious as heck that he gets to miss a date at the top of the World Trade Center in the restaurant that he often goes to for breakfast, and goes to a dermatologist instead, where he speaks with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu almost on a weekly basis, and has affiliations with certain Israeli companies in Israel itself and here in the United States, New York City. His company, Silverstein Properties, is also funded by, and that name, his name escapes me. I forgot his name, who actually gave Silverstein Properties money to help with the property rights of World Trade Center 1, 2, 6, and 5, and 3. He owned 7 and rented a 100-year contract from the Port Authority. Silverstein himself lost billions of dollars in the attacks. And the money that he got from the insurance policy, he tried to get World Trade Center 1, 2 as a separate issue, and the courts disagreed. So they gave him $4.6 billion. And what he did was he invested, I think it was, $250 million itself. And they actually lost the property rights in the bid to Vornado Realty at first. But Vornado Realty, who won the property rights to World Trade Center, basically disagreed with the insurance of the World Trade Center, and they dropped out. And Silverstein Properties, who was second in the bid, they took over because they were second in the bid. And basically, terrorism insurance basically comes with it. World Trade Center was a victim of terrorism in 1993, and has always been a victim of terrorist operations through intelligence services operations involving Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups inside the United States. So terrorism insurance was of course, inside the terrorism insurance policies written by Silverstein Properties. That's nothing suspicious about that. Silverstein was awarded $4.6 billion, and every single dollar went, and I'm talking about every penny, went to the rebuilding of the World Trade Center that you see today. In fact, he owed so much money that he lost property rights to the biggest prominent building in the World Trade, One World Trade. He lost property rights to that. He was also sued in 2010 by construction workers who weren't who weren't getting their full payment regarding the rebuilding of the World Trade Center complex, and they won. So there you have it. Silverstein Properties lost billions of dollars regarding the attacks itself, and that's that. Sean Russell. I dropped you. You dropped. You lost me, Sean. We lost you, pal. That's all right. Is anybody else? Maybe Sean? I'll invite you to speak. I guess not. Nah, your connection's always off and on, Sean. That's the problem. That's what you get for living in Alaska. But if I don't get Sean, if there's no more questions, I can end it here. It is 9:01, 2 hours. It's about an hour of talking, hour questions and answers. They're pretty good. By the way, I didn't talk about Pacheco Plot. Actually, my first Twitter space was about 9/11 itself, and then, there's Sean. And my second talk was about Israeli art student. So next time I speak will be about Pacheco Plot. Sean, go ahead.
Hey, I think I'm back.
Yes, you are.
All right. You know, Adam, I always find it really fascinating because it's almost like this gets brought up every time. And you even alluded to it about the way our attention gets directed when it comes to investigating and really trying to put the pieces together with this puzzle, the puzzle of 9/11. We tend to pursue these intriguing yet fruitless. I mean, you call them the fringe conspiracies, and I think that's a fair enough name. I tend to look at this also, and I notice the way we only talk about, was the airplane legit? We only talk about, was there a bomb? In really, really simple, limited, but they're memes. We really only think in memes and bumper sticker slogans and these little sloganeering mantras about, did you know a third building fell that day, and jet fuel can't melt steel beams, etc. It goes on. And these memes are still to this day the typical default fallback, ever present paths to nowhere, I believe is what Ryan Dawson called them. Vague paths to nowhere is what he called them. There's so many of these. And as you always mention, nobody takes the time to look at the actual suspects, or at least suspects who are in direct connection to a provable crime. Throwing around the idea of, was there some kind of inside job regarding Building 7, right? That's where, according to the memes and in the gospel of 9/11 truth, we've taken Building 7 and we've made it into its own conspiracy. It's like a new conspiracy that gets invented that's not directly connected with what can be established as 9/11 fact. There's the additional conspiracy, which implies grand and, I mean, I dare say racist, a really big, obnoxious conspiracy is what it implies, that is basically impossible to prove. And even the presentation of this kind of wacky, almost Alex Jones level, like it's really evangelical and obnoxious. We might as well be talking about space aliens in 9/11, and Julie Wood with their space beam. Because it's a distraction or a diversion, or at least something that burns your time. Maybe it further radicalizes your worldview. As you alluded to, also, CIA doesn't have to brainwash the truth movement. If you just allow them to cook in their little echo chamber, they'll turn themselves into something completely ridiculous and maybe even useful, like QAnon. So we spend all this time looking at buildings, and I mean, I can only imagine that truthers just watch Building 7 the last 6 seconds of its life or whatever, collapsing over and over and over again, because they can't even pronounce the name Nawaf al-Hazmi. And if you try to have a discussion about the strange peculiarities of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, they're not even sure who you're talking about. Maybe you're trying to save time in a comments section somewhere and you talk about KSM, and truthers start getting mean with you because they don't understand what a KSM is. I think Building 7 has ultimately served that function. Whether or not that's by design, who knows, but it really seems to effectively be that way, because we don't commonly talk about Jerome Powell. And usually we talk about Lucky the financial aspects of this proposed real estate conspiracy, right? The way that this proposed conspiracy just doesn't make sense. And I have to, again, presume that in a court situation, you'd be going up the very best lawyers that's going to completely shred that kind of argument. Because even if Larry Silverstein had been successful in this proposed property management conspiracy, I mean, what would it have been for him? A wash? He lost tremendous dollars as it was. Maybe if he had saved a little bit, he wouldn't have profited. So the whole thing just looks ridiculous. And again, the building definitely burned all day. There have been, I believe the number is 6. I believe it's 3 instances before and 3 instances after where steel frame high rises have collapsed due to fires. And I'm pretty sure that that's all that the opposition is going to need to lay out to completely neutralize that whole angle. You're not going to be successful with that. There's no good leverage behind it. There's no teeth, as Tim, I think, might say. So I often think about these distraction. They're placeholder distraction theories, and they prevent you from ever examining the anomalous profile of Ziad Jarrah because you're convinced that Flight 93 never existed in the first place. And so I think that's why it's important that not only we recognize the people who are really making efforts to progress things forward and not be stuck at ground zero for 20 years. Right? Case in point, I think. And what's required is standards and accountability and really recognizing the weight of what this matter is and respecting it. I think that there's a lot of personality flaws which contribute to this stagnant movement. It's not a movement. It hasn't gone anywhere. Even the people who are originally flying the banners have pretty much said, perhaps privately and not so publicly, but it's definitely common to hear that people have very much lost their optimism. And I think that this may be the naive perspective. And I alluded to this in a previous discussion about Orientalist glasses. We in the West, hey, right, I've never seen the truth movement in the Middle East, right? You know what I mean? But we in the West who are obsessed with it, we've got Orientalist glasses by large, and we interpret the world in a way that, I mean, it's almost like it's a way that the Zionists would want you to be or something. It's absurd. We don't think Arabs are capable of doing anything clever and maybe outsmarting us. We've got an almost racist attitude, and it permeates even into 9/11 truth. And we're trying to make Mighty Whitey the responsible one for everything. It's almost like the conspiracy theorists are not much better than the mainstream media in that regard. So what I think is Building 7 is an anti-Semitic trap. And I think the destruction of World Trade Center is psychologically gripping. I think it's very impactful. I think even conspiracy theorists are mesmerized by it. And they don't ever think about things in terms of the historical pretext terrorism Maybe we know a little bit about Iraq, but the common truther doesn't really have anything spicy to say about Libya. All of this can be traced back, and that's why it's great that Adam covers the transition of Al Qaeda into something different when it becomes this chimera of sorts. But when Tim Osman is the CIA agent bin Laden from some random paper that's been floating around the internet for years and nobody's ever been able to tell me what it exactly is or what it's from, we've got this very limited and tinted optics on something like a 9/11, and the audacity to think that we've somehow solved it by stories about drones and crisis actors and space beams. And it's that kind of reckoning that's lacking from even people who may be in earnest. So I think that there's some importance to at least being comfortable with recognizing our mistakes and making the needed adjustments. Thanks.
Yeah, you said a mouth there, and you know what? I'll just briefly talk about, because I see Gary has his hand up. I'll briefly talk about the Jewish conspiracy involving 9/11. That's often misconstrued or misunderstood, and it comes from Larry Silverstein and his part in 9/11. And the ironic of that position is that Silverstein is a leading nowhere. But yet they throw away even a bigger conspiracy, an actual anomaly of Israelis, the Israeli part with 9/11. And that is something that you hinted at before when you just spoke, and that's Ziad Jarrah. But because of the fringe conspiracy theorists, disbelief of hijackers, that means they don't do the background or the due diligence of doing research into Ziad Jarrah and his background and his family background in Israeli intelligence. Not just Israeli intelligence, but Libyan intelligence and an uncle that is involved with the Abu Nidal organization in Sam al-Jarrah. Ali al-Jarrah, and I'll just mention this, Ali al-Jarrah was a Lebanese school teacher who was involved with being an informant. Well, he was actually a paid informant for Israeli Mossad for 25 years. And his brother, Joseph al-Jarrah, was assisting him for 10 of those years. But this is never brought up in the fringe movement regarding Israel and their ties with 9/11. But they sorely, one thing I could say is that with my experience in dealing with fringe conspiracy theorists, they blame 9/11 on Israel. But they always used Dov Zakheim and Larry Silverstein as the actual anomalies to the ties of 9/11. Meanwhile, you'll never hear them speak about Ali al-Jarrah, Nassim al-Jarrah, and that Ziad Jarrah may have been an Israeli mole who may have not been on Flight 93. And there's a conspiracy that no one talks about, because if you don't talk about hijackers and you don't believe planes were hijacked and you don't believe in phone calls and you think they're faked, well, guess what? You just threw out what may be, and it's speculation, but it's reasonable speculation. There may have been an Israeli mole within the plane's operation all the way to the day itself, and this wasn't shared with anybody outside of Israel. And that operative is Ziad Jarrah. And when you look into his family profile, you'll notice that there's a heavy presence of Israeli intelligence regarding certain members of his family. If he was an al-Qaeda operative, why didn't al-Qaeda do a background search on Ziad Jarrah? Would they have noticed that there was Israeli moles within the group? Maybe, maybe not. But for him to be involved with the most important operation in terrorism history and to not fit within that profile, because he's actually not a militant. He never was in his whole profile, if you ever looked into his profile. But fringe conspiracy theorists don't look into these profiles because they don't believe in hijackers. What's the sense of looking into their profiles? So that means there's a limit to their investigation 9/11 as a whole. And that's what Sean just reiterated. And it's very important. Gary, go ahead, pal.
Point taken, Sean. But as the speculator here, Gary likes to speculate. I think a lot of the things you guys lump into fringe do have some evidence. Muhammad Atta's father stated he received a phone call from Atta after the attacks. William Rodriguez witnessed explosions in the basement. The lobby was blown to bits. The official story is jet fuel raced down 90 floors to blow out the lobby. There's a lot of anomalies and inconsistencies, and I think it's worth keeping an open mind because this is a huge mystery and a huge puzzle, and I'll keep plugging away at that because that's my interest here. Thanks, guys.
Oh, Gary, let me just make this from my personal opinion. I don't consider William Rodriguez friend, Muhammad Atta's father did say that, but Muhammad Atta's father basically admitted later on that Muhammad Atta was killed, but he was killed at the hands of the Israeli Mossad and American intelligence. Look, did he call his father? We don't know. We don't know if he did. It's coming from his father, so there is some prejudice to it. But I don't dismiss it. And do I consider that fringe? Boy, that's a tough question. I don't know. Fringe would be, Gary. Fringe would be like irrational theories that are not based on any empirical evidence. For example, no hijacked planes. That would mean that every single airline, United and American Airlines, the FAA, the National Transportation Safety Board, the first responders in New York City, Washington, and Pennsylvania, all have to be in on it or coerced. To me, that's fringe. That's fringe. Because how do you shut all those people up? How do you get all those people? What if they're all crisis actors? Or if they're coerced by what? Some agency or some intelligence apparatus? Then that would mean that all those people, thousands of people, would have to be closely monitored by an agent of some agency for 21 years. Okay? It's not reasonable. What is reasonable? That the planes were hijacked, that they crashed unabated into their targets. This way, you don't have to involve many people. What you do have to involve are the highest levels of government at the highest levels of, say, NORAD, the CIA, the NSA. Does that sound reasonable? Hell yeah. I can make a great argument that they were involved at some level. But yeah, involving all those people to say that there weren't plane hijackings, that the plane hijackings didn't crash into the World Trade Center, Pentagon, Shanksville, and you don't have to do any type of background investigation into the hijackers and intelligence services, thereby eliminating so many anomalies involving Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, that you can't blame Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States for any part of 9/11. Anything. That's what happens when you eliminate hijackers. That's why it's so imperative to right the ship, as Sean said, so to speak. And, we don't have many rational voices, unfortunately. And yeah, Gary, I speculate. But I make sure to tell my audience if I am speculating. That's something the fringe conspiracy movement really doesn't do generally. They basically, Jason Burmis from Loose Change, co-producer Loose Change, he speculates. And he doesn't tell you he's speculating because he uses it as a form of evidence. And that's disingenuous. And, that we need more honesty, more openness. As you said, Gary, I think you're right about that. Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, Adam, the fringe. I think probably let's not get all tied up in what that spectrum actually looks like when we measure it. It really just comes down to what can you show? What can you attach a name to? And does that name pass a basic credibility test? And I think if we just start to think in terms of what an opposition might look like in terms of some kind of legal pursuit, just assume that if you've got a weak argument, the lawyer's going to be able to tear it apart. That's what they do. That's what they're good at. They live for it. And they'll eat you alive, and you'll be in contempt. You'll be fined. The fringe conspiracies is pretty easy to identify. If it's something that isn't going to directly advance your case it might be dead weight, and some of it is hazardous. I hope that makes sense. But even William Rodriguez doesn't agree with the fringe conspiracies. He doesn't like the no-planer crowd. And he's the guy that says that there was an explosion in the basement on 9/11 before the first plane hit. And he, and I believe it was at least one other coworker, had been in World Trade in 1993 when there was a bomb in the basement. And they remembered that instance. And when Rodriguez tells this story, you know, he's alluding to the fact that there could have been a bomb in the basement. You know what Rodriguez said was, he said that following that explosion from below, it smelled like ammonia. He said it smelled like ammonia. I like to speculate. Well, here's some speculation. Does he know what a urea nitrate bomb smells like by name? Or does he just know what that bomb that he experienced smells like? He may not know exactly the specifics of how that bomb was crafted, but he knew it had a smell. It's interesting to think about. And when you consider that there were the possibility of this multitude of semi-independent cells who were in position in the United States for years, who at different times over the couple of years, basically, I mean, coinciding with Al Qaeda basically coming into existence, were these series of attacks on the Americas. And if there's so many of these potential plots involving a variety of methods, there could be bombs, they could be, the hijackings. There's a variety of things that could have been possible. It's not too deep with the speculation, or it's definitely not fringe to wonder if there could have been a team involved with a truck bombing to just add to it. I mean, why not? It almost worked the first time, basically, and they would have studied their own history. Any of these operatives would have known the previous examples of whatever their method was. It's not weird to wonder if there was a truck bomb. That's not to say that necessarily every floor was rigged. I think that's an interesting filter to run things through, because kind of like the crisis actor theories or planting light poles and plane parts theories, what you've got is a logistical problem with being able to actually do this stuff. And I mean, it just sounds ludicrous, really, to me. I'm no expert, but it sounds ludicrous to think that you would, as a conspirator, make an operation so big, difficult to manage, and hard to cover up, when historically you can just look to the fact that there are opportunities which can be capitalized on. So you just allow something that's going to happen anyway to happen if you're able. And in this network where the watchdogs didn't bark, this security apparatus surrounding 9/11, which apparently it fails at like certain key points where it almost looks like it could have been orchestrated, but it still passes the plausible deniability test barely. People shrug it off and say, gosh, we failed. That makes sense, because now you've only got a handful of people that have to put themselves in any kind of threatening position, compared to an operation that's proposed with the fringe conspiracy theories involving everything from Truman Show level entire towns of crisis actors to space aliens on the far reaches. Again, none of that is going to get anywhere with anybody. Maybe going back to how naive conspiracy theorists are, it's almost as if some people are so limited that they just have to presume that everyone else is as limited as they are. So Rodriguez, it's fine. That's great. I agree. But what the tangible evidence is, well, that's urban moving systems and the FBI investigation and the redacted results of an explosives test on the van that they were driving. That's where you go with it. And never mind all the other stuff that's just going to make you look kooky, because at least Urban Moving Systems was involved in crime. They had charges against them. You don't look like such a big asshole compared to when you're trying to talk Building 7, if you get my drift. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think this is the essence of 9/11 here, right? What can we, if we look at 9/11 like a hobbyist, we're led to believe whatever we want to believe. But if we look at it like an investigator, a responsible investigator that's going to court, we're going to look at 9/11 like an investigator with hard facts. So whatever you believe about 9/11, think of yourself like an investigator, that the information that you have collected about 9/11, can you bring it to court and can you prosecute somebody? And I think that's the best way to look at 9/11 as a whole. If you look at it like a hobbyist, yeah, that's fine. I mean, but you're not considered like a serious researcher. You're just looking at it like a hobbyist would. And you can make unfounded speculations, but that's the end of that. You'll live on the internet, but you'll never come out of it. If you want to do more, then you can't look at it like a hobbyist would. Someone who wants more than just proposing on a video about how Larry Silverstein's involved and how planes were actually drones, outfitted to look like planes. If you go to court with that, you'll have a frivolous lawsuit. Now, I'll use an example, April Gallup, who the fringe movements like to use as evidence for no plane hitting the Pentagon, because she basically comes out of a hole and says that she didn't see plane debris. Now, I've come into the information from her own words, in which she did an interview with the Library of Congress in the weeks after 9/11, where she said that she didn't walk out of the hole, that she fainted, and that her and her child, a baby, her son, were actually helped out of the burning building of the Pentagon. And that she was accosted by Citizens Investigation Team, who thinks that a plane actually flew over the Pentagon and an explosion happened at the Pentagon, ignoring over 86 people who saw an American Airlines plane crash into the Pentagon. And April Gallup actually went on to sue Dick Cheney and Joint Chiefs of Staff Richard Myers. It was the second civil suit that got her into the most trouble, in which she actually went on to sue Dick Cheney, George Bush, Richard Myers, but this time she added American Airlines and Osama bin Laden in a 2011 civil suit, in which she went to court and handed to a judge, and the judge not only deemed her case a frivolous lawsuit, but went on to sue, or not sue, but hand out a hefty $15,000 fine to all three lawyers representing April Gallup due to the egregious nature of the frivolous lawsuit. That's what awaits people like Jason Burmis. That's what awaits Barbara Honegger, and that's what awaits every single fringe conspiracy theorist if they ever got out of the internet and went into a court. And that's why I'm quite anal when it comes to 9/11 and how you approach it. And I show no mercy or hesitation in calling out these people, because they do damage not to themselves, but to people like us, responsible people who are trying to hold people accountable to the events of September 11th regarding pre-intelligence and what they allowed to transpire and what they didn't share, or maybe even facilitated. But it doesn't help when you have people who represent a truth movement and propose these theories, who go on and harm people who are affiliated with the movement, who are questioning the United States government and foreign intelligence services. And I'm going to wrap it up at that. It's 9:30. You guys got lives, and I'll let it go. We've been here 2.5 hours. thank you very much for coming, really, and for being a part of this discussion and for making these discussions happen. And I wouldn't be anywhere without you. And that's the truth, for having any interest. Next week, I'll talk about Bajinka plot, and we'll talk about the involvement of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Youssef, and what the intelligence services didn't do with the information, which led to the plane's operation of September 11, 2001. So everyone have a good night. Enjoy the week and the weekend. I'll see you next week.